What I observe unfolding with Trump's systematic operation to capture Nicolas Maduro represents nothing less than the most dangerous expansion of executive authority over foreign policy in modern American history. And what troubles me most profoundly is that we are witnessing systematic regime change operations conducted through intelligence and military assets without congressional authorization, constitutional oversight, or any coherent legal framework that would justify what amounts to kidnapping a foreign head of state. The intelligence assessments I have reviewed indicate that Trump authorized Special Operations Command and CIA assets to conduct capture operations against Maduro through coordinated military and intelligence activities that operate far beyond any traditional counterterrorism authorities or law enforcement jurisdictions. And I think when we examine the broader implications of these operations, we are looking at unprecedented presidential assumption of war powers that circumvents every democratic accountability mechanism our Constitution establishes for military action against foreign nations. The intelligence is crystal clear, that American Special Operations Forces conducted systematic planning and execution phases for Maduro capture that involved extensive coordination between CIA operatives, military special operations teams, and regional intelligence partnerships with Colombian and other Latin American intelligence services, all operating under executive authorities that exceed any previous presidential use of military force for regime change objectives. Congressional oversight committees received minimal briefings about capture planning while lacking any authority to authorize, modify, or prevent operations that constitute acts of war against Venezuelan sovereignty. And you know, what makes this particularly troubling is that Trump's legal justification relies on counterterrorism statutes and drug enforcement authorities that were never intended for regime change operations against foreign governments, regardless of their authoritarian nature or criminal activities. I think what we need to understand about this Maduro capture operation is that it represents systematic abandonment of constitutional frameworks that require congressional authorization for military actions that could trigger international conflicts or fundamentally alter regional security relationships. The War Powers Resolution assumes presidential military authority operates within defined parameters and time limitations while Congress maintains ultimate authority over sustained military operations. But Trump's capture operation demonstrates executive willingness to conduct comprehensive regime change activities without any congressional consultation, authorization, or oversight that would ensure democratic accountability for decisions that affect international law, regional stability, and American constitutional governance. Congressional intelligence briefings reveal systematic expansion of CIA and Special Operations Command authorities beyond traditional counterterrorism missions into comprehensive regime change operations that blur distinctions between law enforcement, intelligence collection, and military action in ways that exceed existing legal frameworks and accountability mechanisms. The intelligence community justified Maduro capture operations under drug trafficking and terrorism authorities while conducting activities that constitute warfare against sovereign nations, and I have to say, this represents systematic expansion of executive power that operates beyond constitutional constraints while establishing dangerous precedent for future presidential use of military force without democratic oversight or international law compliance. You know, when I analyze the regional implications of American capture operations against Latin American leaders, what becomes clear is that Trump's Maduro operation systematically undermines hemispheric relationships and sovereignty principles that have enabled peaceful conflict resolution and regional cooperation for decades. Colombian government cooperation with American capture operations creates systematic strain with other Latin American nations that view Maduro capture as violation of inter-American legal frameworks and diplomatic protocols, while Brazilian and Mexican leadership express formal opposition to American military operations within hemispheric boundaries that operate without regional organization consultation or approval. What troubles me most about the international law implications is that Maduro capture operations violate fundamental principles of state sovereignty, diplomatic immunity, and international criminal procedure that govern relationships between nations regardless of their domestic governance systems or leadership legitimacy. International law provides specific mechanisms for addressing alleged criminal activity by foreign officials through extradition extradition treaties, international criminal courts, and diplomatic negotiations. But Trump's capture operation ignores these frameworks while establishing precedent that any nation can conduct military operations to kidnap foreign leaders based on domestic law enforcement justifications that other nations could apply against American officials operating internationally. The constitutional crisis implications extend far beyond immediate questions about Maduro capture into systematic demonstration that American executive branch believes it can conduct warfare and regime change operations without constitutional authorization, congressional oversight, or judicial review of military activities that affect international relationships and regional security. Trump's operation demonstrates presidential assumption of authority to use military force against foreign nations based solely on executive determination of American interests. And I think when we consider the broader precedent implications, we are looking at fundamental transformation of American constitutional governance toward authoritarian concentration of war powers in executive branch without democratic accountability mechanisms. But there is also the question of operational legitimacy and post-capture planning that reveals systematic inadequacy of Trump administration preparation for managing Venezuelan political transition, governance reconstruction, and regional stability requirements that successful regime change operations would necessitate. Intelligence assessments indicate minimal planning for post-capture governance scenarios, while Venezuelan opposition groups lack unified leadership, popular legitimacy, or institutional capacity for managing political transition from Maduro removal. And, this suggests that capture operations prioritize symbolic political objectives over practical governance considerations that sustainable democratic transition would require. I am analyzing intelligence community assessments regarding Russian and Cuban support for Venezuelan defense that indicate systematic foreign involvement in Maduro protection through military advisors, intelligence cooperation, and security assistance that could escalate American capture operations into direct confrontation with Russian or Cuban military personnel operating within Venezuelan territory. Russian Wagner Group contractors and Cuban intelligence operatives provide comprehensive security support for Maduro regime while maintaining operational relationships that could trigger great power confrontation through American military operations. And I think what this demonstrates is that regime change operations in contemporary international system inevitably involve great power competition considerations that Trump administration systematically underestimated in operational planning. The economic implications of regime change through military capture operations extend beyond immediate costs of special operations deployment into systematic disruption of Venezuelan oil production, regional trade relationships, and international commodity markets that depend on political stability assumptions for pricing and supply chain coordination. Venezuelan oil sector collapse through regime change warfare would create additional pressure on global energy markets, while regional economic integration suffers systematic disruption from military conflict and political uncertainty that affects Colombian, Brazilian, and other regional economies that depend on Venezuelan trade and energy cooperation. Congressional authority over regime change operations faces systematic erosion through executive branch expansion of counterterrorism and drug enforcement authorities into comprehensive military activities that Congress never authorized or intended for foreign policy implementation. The legal framework for American military operations abroad assumes clear distinctions between law enforcement activities, intelligence collection, and military action, but Trump's capture operation demonstrates executive willingness to combine these authorities for regime change objectives while circumventing congressional oversight and constitutional authorization requirements for acts of war against foreign nations. What makes this capture operation particularly dangerous for American international relationships is that it demonstrates systematic abandonment of alliance consultation and international cooperation frameworks that enable coordinated responses to authoritarian governance and regional security challenges. European allies, United Nations frameworks, and Organization of American States institutions provide diplomatic mechanisms for addressing Venezuelan political crisis through multilateral pressure and negotiated solutions, but Trump's military capture operation ignores these institutional relationships while establishing precedent that American foreign policy operates through unilateral military action rather than international cooperation and alliance coordination. I think we also need to recognize that successful Maduro capture creates immediate precedent for other authoritarian leaders and great power competitors to justify similar operations against American officials or allied leaders through domestic legal authorities and national security justifications that mirror American reasoning for Venezuelan regime change operations. Chinese intelligence services, Russian military operations, and Iranian proxy networks observe American capture techniques, legal justifications, and operational methods that could be adapted for operations against American targets while maintaining similar claims about law enforcement necessity and national security protection. The intelligence community's role in regime change operations raises systematic questions about CIA and military intelligence authorities, oversight mechanisms, and accountability frameworks that current congressional intelligence oversight cannot adequately address when operations occur under executive direction without legislative authorization or judicial review. Intelligence agencies operate under authorities designed for intelligence collection and counterterrorism support rather than comprehensive regime change implementation, and systematic expansion of intelligence authorities into military operations creates constitutional and legal problems that existing oversight frameworks cannot resolve through traditional committee structures and briefing protocols. Recovery scenarios from constitutional crisis created by unauthorized regime change operations require comprehensive restoration of congressional war powers, judicial oversight of military activities, and international law compliance that current political frameworks cannot adequately provide through existing institutional mechanisms. Constitutional recovery from executive overreach requires systematic legislative action to reestablish congressional authority over military operations while ensuring that future presidents cannot conduct regime change activities without constitutional authorization and democratic oversight of decisions that affect international law and regional security relationships. As I conclude this analysis, I recognize that Trump's Maduro capture operation represents more than foreign policy decision or regime change activity, but rather systematic constitutional crisis that demonstrates executive branch willingness to conduct warfare against foreign nations without democratic authorization, while establishing precedent for authoritarian expansion of presidential power over international relationships that operate beyond constitutional constraints. The decisions made about executive authority over regime change operations, congressional oversight of military activities, and constitutional frameworks for foreign policy implementation will determine whether American governance operates under democratic accountability mechanisms or whether executive branch can systematically conduct warfare and international operations without constitutional limitation or popular control over military decisions that affect global stability and international law compliance.